My name is Elizabeth Dunn, and I'm going to be talking about what pre-registration is really like. It's actually surprising to me to be talking about this topic because when I first heard about pre-registration, I thought pre-registration sounds like a really bad idea. I was on board with the other ideas for improving research practices, like having larger samples and open data, but I thought pre-registration would create all kinds of problems. I thought pre-registration would slow down our research, it would prevent exploratory work, it would preclude us from doing the kinds of high-impact field studies that our lab especially likes to do, and ultimately it would make research boring. And then something weird happened. I changed my mind. As a result of listening to compelling arguments by people like Samin Vazir and Joe Cesario, I started to think, maybe there's something to this whole pre-registration idea. So I decided, let's give it a go. Now, this pretty much meant saying to my graduate students, go do this thing that isn't done in our field, that we have no model for, and that I haven't been trained to do myself. But I was actually pretty excited about it. I thought, this is going to be like our gift to science. But as is so often the case in my life, the idealized vision didn't quite match up with the actual reality. This is a picture of when I took my son and my Welsh corgi to see Santa, and the expressions on their faces kind of capture the expressions that some of us had when we first tried out pre-registration. So in today's talk, I want to take you into this messier reality and share with you some of the embarrassing blunders that we made in first trying out this new system, with the hope that maybe I can save you from making some of the same mistakes and perhaps ultimately help move us all a little bit closer to that idealized vision. So when pre-registration first came onto our radar and we tried it out, there were no templates available. So there was just no consistency in the length or content of the pre-registration documents that we were creating. And I take a quick look at what my students drafted up, but I was looking at these in that sort of heady early stage of idea generation and not really carefully checking these documents. Now, this didn't work out so well. And for example, we pre-registered in one study what was actually an untestable hypothesis and really a nonsensical hypothesis. In another case, we wrote the whole pre-registration and then failed to actually post it on the Open Science Framework, thereby rendering it useless. So after sort of messing around with this for a while, we decided that we needed to be a little more careful and systematic in our process. So now I check all of our pre-registration documents as carefully as I would check a manuscript that we're about to publish. In addition, I decided to create a worksheet, a standardized template that my lab could use for every study that we wanted to pre-register. To create this, I first reviewed all of the existing templates that I could find, and these really run the gamut from very bare bones approaches to pre-registrations to extremely meticulous and detailed ones that would probably take me like a day or a week to complete. So I had to think about what my goals were, and I decided what I wanted was to create something that my graduate students could draft up in about an hour, and this meant that it wouldn't completely eliminate our researcher degrees of freedom because I wasn't asking my students to, for example, draft up all of the syntax that they would use. But my goal was just to try to reduce researcher degrees of freedom, to constrain us in a way that would keep our type 1 error rate under control. Now, the worksheet that I eventually came up with is closely modeled on the system used at aspredicted.org. And if you haven't been to this website, I highly recommend that you go check out aspredicted.org. When you visit this website, the first question that you'll see is, have any data been collected for this study already? And you have to say no. Kind of makes sense. I mean, this is supposed to be a pre-registration, but we realized that this approach was too restrictive and would prevent us from pre-registering many of the studies that we conduct in our lab. So in our template, the very first question is, have any data been collected for this study yet? And if the answer is yeah, some data have been collected, then we explain why and explain the whole situation. So to illustrate this, we recently conducted a field experiment in which we gave participants $80 over the course of 2 weeks, and we assigned them to, during 1 week, to spend part of this money on a material purchase. During the other week, we asked them to spend money on a purchase that would save them time. Now, this was a new paradigm for us, so we wanted to test it out and make sure that people could actually follow these instructions. But after we ran a few pilot subjects, everything was going swimmingly, money, so we wanted to go ahead and continue with the study and pre-register it, but we didn't want to throw away those pilot subjects because after all, they cost us a lot of time and money. So what we do is to say some data have been collected. We have collected pilot data from 6 participants to ensure the procedure was workable, but the data haven't been entered or examined in any way. So this provides one specific example of a case where having a little bit more flexibility enables us to pre-register this relatively complicated field experiment. More broadly, though, I think we need some flexibility in pre-registration, in part because of the difficulty of forecasting ahead of time what kind of sample size you'll need. Now, of course, in figuring out our sample size, we rely on power analysis, but power analysis basically means estimating an unknown from an unknown. That is, you have to figure out what sample size you're going to need based on the effect size, which you also don't know. Now, that would be okay if a ballpark estimate of the effect size gave you a pretty good idea of the sample size you would need, but unfortunately that turns out not to be the case. In fact, even small changes in effect size lead to pretty big changes in the sample size that you need. So for example, just going from a D of 0.4 to a D of 0.5 has pretty major ramifications for the size of the sample that you'll require. So in my opinion, power analysis is actually a misleadingly fancy term for what is really just an educated guess. So how do we pre-register our sample size knowing that it's really hard to actually predict ahead of time how many people we're going to need? Well, I think the best solution, and one that we use very often, is just to collect a ton of data. We basically collect way more data than we think we'll need. That works great whenever we can do it, but of course, I kind of have a penchant for designing expensive, time-consuming studies, and so in these cases, we need to be a little bit more conservative in estimating our sample size. And for this reason, I found a lot of value in p-augmented, and if you haven't read Sagarin et al.'s 2014 paper describing this approach, I highly recommend checking it out. We use p-augmented when we think we know the effect size, and it turns out that we're wrong. So for example, if we run 100 people, look at the data, and then it turns out, gosh, it looks like the effects are there, but they're not as strong as we expected. We can use p-augmented to collect more data while keeping our type 1 error rate in check. Now, in going through this process, we've actually discovered how little we really know, how hard it is to actually predict the sample size that we'll need ahead of time. So for this reason, we now often pre-register studies with sequential analysis. And Lakins, in his 2014 paper, provides a really clear and easy introduction to this topic. So we use sequential analysis when we know that we don't know what kind of sample size we're going to need. So for example, in that spending study I mentioned, we pre-registered that we would initially collect 60 participants within subjects design. We'd look at the data. If it wasn't significant, we would keep going up to a maximum sample size that we could afford of 90. And for an example of what this pre-registration with sequential analysis looks like, we posted this pre-registration document up on our website. So sequential analysis is really helpful in getting us around this problem of the difficulty of predicting sample sizes ahead of time, but it doesn't solve everything. That is, the world is still an unpredictable place. So for example, we recently ran a field experiment outside, and this was a direct replication of a study that we'd run previously, so we had a pretty good idea of what the effect size would be. We decided to run 220 people with 90% power, but of course the study had to be run outside. We were running it in the fall in Vancouver, and people were signing up for it a little more slowly than we had hoped. And meanwhile, the weather was taking a turn for the worse. So pretty soon the weather was going to preclude us from continuing to run this field experiment. So what do? Do we hold up my graduate student's dissertation project by 4 months while we wait for the clouds to clear? Didn't seem like such a great solution. So instead, we completed a second pre-registration in which we said we're going to stop no matter what on October 16th, and we're just going to shoot for 80% power. Then in the paper, we provided links to both the original and the updated pre-registrations, enabling both readers and reviewers to see exactly what we were doing and how we made these decisions. So our goal then isn't so much to really eliminate researcher flexibility. I think as researchers, to do the kind of work we want to do, we need a little bit of flexibility. Instead, our goal is to openly document it so that readers and reviewers can see what we've done. Now, I said at the beginning that initially I was concerned that pre-registration would slow down the research process. And to some extent, that turns out to be true. With our relatively simple, streamlined approach to pre-registration, filling out the actual pre-registration worksheet doesn't really take all that long, but it does actually make us stop to think a little bit more. And in going through this process of just filling out, here's what our DVs are, here's what our mediators are, we've sometimes come to recognize areas in which members of the team actually aren't seeing things in the same way. So for example, in one case, I was thinking of a variable as a mediator, but one of my collaborators was seeing it as a DV. And just pausing to get all of this stuff on paper can be helpful in figuring out that we're making sure that we're all on the same page and ensuring that the study is designed in an optimal way. Now, these benefits are really amplified with pre-registration journals such as CRSP. We've now submitted 2 papers to CRSP, and the way it works is pretty cool. So you submit the intro and your methods, and then it goes out for peer review, and the peer reviewers judge the paper based on the importance of the research question and the rigor of the methods. Now, we've probably all had this experience where you submit a paper to a regular journal, and reviewer 3 gives some important suggestion of how you could have done one of your studies better. But if you don't want to rerun the whole study, you just have to kind of try to argue against that reviewer's point. But with CRSP, because you get that feedback before you conduct the research, rather than trying to argue against, the smart reviewer's point, you can actually utilize it to improve your study. So again, we really get this added value with this pre-registration journal. Now, another concern of mine was that pre-registration would reduce our ability to conduct exploratory research. But in fact, we found just the opposite. For us, it turns out that pre-registration enables us, frees us to use more exploratory measures. Now, to illustrate why this is the case, let me just tell you briefly about one study that we conducted back in the day before we started engaging in pre-registration. So this was a 2-week field experiment in which we randomly assigned people to maximize their use of email during 1 week and to minimize their use of email during the other week. Now we thought that when people minimized their use of email, they would experience less distraction and less feelings of stress on a day-to-day basis. But because this was the first study of its kind and because it took about a year to conduct, we threw in a bunch of well-being measures, kind of the kitchen sink, everything from positive affect to meaning in life. And so when this paper came out and got a lot of media attention, people helpfully took to the internet and pointed out that perhaps the significant results we observed on our key measures might just be one big type 1 error. Now, this is a fair point because when you have a whole bunch of measures, it is possible to get significant results on a couple of them just as a fluke. So this experience made me start to think that perhaps when we conduct studies like this, we shouldn't include exploratory measures because that would dilute the impact of our key measures, making people perceive them as just, type 1 errors. However, pre-registration helps to solve this dilemma. With pre-registration, we can actually include as many exploratory measures as we want, but simply distinguish them from our confirmatory hypotheses using our pre-registration document. So this frees us to do more exploratory research and to do so without diluting the impact of our primary investigation. So in this way, but also more broadly, pre-registration has helped enable us to conduct expensive studies efficiently. In particular, I think in our field, there's often a kind of knee-jerk demand for replication. I think that's all well and good. If you've just run 200 people on MTurk, by all means, go out and replicate it. But in one case, for example, we conducted a study that cost $50,000 and took 3 years. One is a little less excited to run out and replicate this sort of study. And so I think pre-registration is very helpful with this kind of research because it can potentially help to give readers and reviewers more confidence in the results and thereby reducing this kind of knee-jerk demand for replication. Also, I think perhaps the one-tailed P is a little bit underused, and we sometimes have very specific directional hypotheses where we think that the experimental group, for example, will be higher than the control group on happiness, and so we can pre-register this specific directional hypothesis, and I think very reasonably use a one-tailed p-value, which thereby enables us to use a more conservative sample size. So I said initially that I predicted that pre-registration would make research boring. Well, this prediction turns out to be wrong. So what I've discovered is that pre-registration does not make research boring If anything, it does the opposite. I want to thank the members of my lab who have given me feedback throughout this entire process and have been very patient on this whole journey. And I want to invite you to check out our worksheet and a sample pre-registration that we've posted on our website. You're welcome to help yourself to this worksheet and modify it to meet your own lab's needs. And with that, I want to wish you luck.